Amen. So it may not be clearly evident from the brief bit of Abraham and Sarah's story that Heidi read for us, but Abraham was in a bit of a holding pattern. See, Abraham had heard this story, this promise of God, many times over. It happened in the first place when Abram was just a mild-mannered guy living in the Ur of the Chaldees, and God called him and said, I want you to take your family and all of your folks, and I want you to go to this land that I've promised you, and there I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky. And Abraham was pretty old by that point. And so Abraham does what God says, expecting that there would be a pitter-patter of little joyous feet fairly soon. And there wasn't. God shows up again, probably as much as 10 years later, and says, I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky. And Abraham, by the way, falls down on his face laughing. No one gives him any flack for that. He's rolling on the floor laughing. And any moment now, he expects to hear the sound, the joyful sound of the pity-patter of tiny little feet. And God shows up again and repeats that promise. It's a holding pattern. If you are a frequent flyer, you know what a holding pattern is. You're up in the plane. You're circling the field. You can see the landing strip. It's right there. And still, you are circling the field, waiting. I find that for me, the duration of a holding pattern is directly proportional to the urgency of my bladder's need. She said bladder in the pulpit. This is what happens when you let the church administrator preach. And I find that the length, the duration of the holding pattern is inversely proportional to the time I have for my layover. If I have 3 hours, holding pattern's over and done with. If I have 40 minutes, it's much longer. Holding pattern. It gets tiresome to be in a holding pattern. Sometimes in our lives, we find ourselves in a holding pattern when we're waiting for the diagnosis, when we're waiting for the test results, when we're waiting for that long-promised check. And particularly for us in the life of our church, we are also in a bit of a holding pattern. We'd be in a holding pattern anyway because it's summer and things slow down around here. And I always think I'll be able to get some of the other chores I'm supposed to do done, but that never happens. But we are also in a holding pattern because we are between one minister and waiting for another. Holding pattern. Hopefully this one's not 25 years long, like it was for Abraham. There's nothing wrong with holding patterns. In fact, a holding pattern is an opportunity to hold space. That's a concept I really wasn't familiar with until I came here. Never heard the phrase before. So I set out to figure out what it means, and I'm still not sure I know what it means. The only difference between holding space and a holding pattern, in my opinion, is intentionality. You make the decision during your holding pattern to watch for whatever it is that God might have in store for you during this holy period of waiting. Our church has the opportunity to hold space, to listen deeply to the Spirit of God, to listen deeply to each other, to be present to each other, to be fully present to God, which is why we do church. It's why we're all here. We are all here we expect that God will do something with us and for us this day. It's tempting when you're in a holding pattern just to rest on your laurels, maybe twiddle your thumbs. But what if we use that time to create space for God to work? Because I want you to notice something about Abraham in this story. Even though Abraham was in a holding pattern, when these three strangers showed up, and by the way, there's no real indication that they're angels. I presume these three ordinary-looking strangers. Abraham could have done just the plain old standard of hospitality that would have been expected of anyone. He could have offered them a bed, whatever leftovers were in the fridge. He could have just said, make yourself comfortable. But because Abraham chose to turn his holding pattern into an opportunity to hold space, he was very intentional about his welcome. He put on the fatted calf. He attended to these strangers with extra special care. He expected that God was about to do something. Expected, in fact, that God would do something different, because in spite of all these conversations that Abraham had with God, this is the first time that anyone bothers talking to Sarah about it. That seems to me to be a key oversight. The messengers of God said, "Where is Sarah, your wife?" And Abraham says, "Well, she's in the tent." As if, why do you want to talk to her? Kind of par for the course of that time of day. And she is on the outskirts listening in. You may find yourself in that place too. You may be thinking to yourself, what's the board of directors up to? What have they been doing about, finding us an interim? And maybe you're listening at the edge of the tent and your ears are peeled. Or maybe you don't care about it at all. But Sarah finally hears the message for herself. And of course she does what anyone in her predicament would do. She laughs. What do you mean? You can't be serious. I've heard this from Abraham for 25 years now. Why should I believe you now? And I like to think that when the angels called her on it, it wasn't like, ooh, you laughed. I like to think that they did it with a smile. You laughed. Perhaps a little bit of gracious inquiry. Why did you laugh? And Sarah immediately thinks, oh my God, I opened my big mouth. Did I make that face out loud? Between Sarah's skepticism and Abraham's willingness to serve, God created a holy law. And the pitter-patter of joyous little feet didn't happen even then as quickly as they might have liked. But we're told that God finally honored the promise that God made. And that God did it in God's time. There's a joke that's told about a man who prays. And he's talking to God and he says, "Oh God, a penny is to you as numerous as all of the gold in the earth. And a second is to you as eras and eons." And he's, really flattering God, sucking up to God in prayer. None of us ever do that. And God finally says, "Okay, child, what is it that you want?" And he says, "God, can I have a penny?" And God says, "In a second." The hardest part about holding space is hanging in there while you're doing it. To consistently make that effort. If you've ever had listening training, and if you've ever been taught how to listen deeply to one another, you know that it costs you something. It takes energy to be fully present to another person. To set aside our devices, our phones. To set aside not only those things, but also our preconceived notions. To set aside our desire to fix things ourselves. I'm a fixer. Sometimes I have to restrain those urges because the person that I'm wanting to fix doesn't want me to fix them. They want me to listen to them, to hear them. Maybe to hear them into speech, into realizing something about themselves that they might not have known just simply because I was fully present there and listened. My friends, this is a golden opportunity for this church. This is an opportunity to hold space. To expect that God will show up. And to not tell God how God is going to show up. One of my favorite bumper stickers. Don't just do something, stand there. Sometimes standing there is the hardest thing of all. And especially for some of our folks that have been in leadership here for a long time, you have seen a lot of turnover in the staff, not just the pastoral staff. And for you especially, it might be tempting to think, oh, here we go again. We survived this the first time, the second time, the third time. Why should I expect things to be any different? And you might be tempted to laugh along with Sarah. And I could not blame you for that. Just as I do not blame Sarah for her laughter. But all I can tell you is that if you make the effort to hold the space, that something will happen. And we may not get what it is that we actually desire, but isn't it better to get what we need? Let us pray. God, help us all in this time of transition in our church. in the times of transition that we are experiencing in our lives, in those holding patterns and waiting periods. Help us to hold space for you, to hold space for one another. Help us, oh God, to allow you to be God. Help us to continue to be the church and make space for you to be God. We ask all these things in your many names. Amen.